The rain hammered against the barracks windows like angry fists, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller fragments that caught the harsh fluorescent light and died. Major Harrison's boots echoed through the corridor with the methodical precision of a man who had never questioned his own authority, never doubted that the world would bend to his will. Behind him, his shadow stretched long and dark, swallowing the institutional green walls that had witnessed 12 years of carefully orchestrated silence. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. In the communications room, Elena Vasquez sat hunched over her desk, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible through sheer competence. The glow from multiple monitors painted her face in shifting blues and whites, highlighting the careful neutrality she had cultivated like armor. At 29, she possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that others often mistook for submission, the sort of stillness that predators interpreted as weakness. "Still here, Vasquez." The voice cut through the electronic hum like a blade through silk. Elena's fingers never paused in their typing, though every nerve in her body suddenly sang with attention. "Yes, sir." Finishing the quarterly reports. Her voice carried the same measured tone she had perfected over 12 years of service, each word carefully weighed and stripped of anything that might be construed as challenge or invitation. Major Harrison stepped into the room, and the space seemed to contract around his presence. He was a man built for intimidation, broad shoulders that filled doorways, hands that had learned to take what they wanted, eyes that cataloged weakness like a predator studying prey. The silver oak leaves on his collar caught the light twin, symbols of a power structure that had never failed him. "Dedicated as always," he said, moving closer. "That's what I've always appreciated about you, Elena, your commitment." The way he said her name made something cold and sharp unfurl in her chest. She had heard that tone before, had watched other women in the unit receive that same calculating attention. Some had transferred, others had simply disappeared into medical leave or early discharge. All had carried that same haunted look in their eyes afterward, as if something essential had been carved out of them and never returned. Elena saved her work with deliberate precision, her movements betraying nothing of the calculations running through her mind. The communications room was isolated, tucked away in the basement level where the thick concrete walls swallowed sound. Above them, the rest of the base slept, trusting that their guardians watched over them through the night. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I appreciate recognition, sir," she replied, beginning to gather her papers. "But I should be getting back to quarters. Early formation tomorrow, should you?" Harrison's question hung in the air like a challenge. He moved around her desk, ostensibly to examine one of the monitors, but Elena could feel the way his proximity shifted the dynamics of the room. She had watched him use space as a weapon before, had seen how he positioned himself to make others feel small, trapped, without options. On her desk sat a small ceramic elephant, no bigger than her thumb. It was painted in cheerful blues and yellows, a gift from her youngest sister Rosa during her last visit home. The elephant's trunk was raised, which Rosa had explained meant good luck, and its tiny eyes seemed to sparkle with some secret knowledge. Elena's gaze fell on it now, and for just a moment, she allowed herself to remember what Rosa had said when she gave it to her. "For when you need to remember how strong you really are." "You know, Elena," Harrison continued, his voice dropping to something that might have been mistaken for intimacy by someone who didn't recognize the predatory undertone, "I've been thinking about your performance reviews. 12 years of exemplary service. That's remarkable dedication." Elena's hand closed around a pen, her grip steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "I've always believed in doing my job well, sir." "Yes, you have. Always so compliant. So willing to work late, to take on extra assignments. so careful never to make waves. He was directly behind her now, close enough that she could smell his aftershave, could feel the heat radiating from his body. I think that kind of loyalty deserves special recognition. The rain continued its assault on the windows, but beneath its chaotic rhythm, Elena could hear something else, the steady, measured sound of her own breathing, the quiet hum of electronics, and underneath it all, the almost inaudible whisper of 12 years of careful observation finally clicking into place. She turned in her chair, the movement controlled and deliberate. Harrison's face was closer than she had expected, his expression holding that particular combination of authority and hunger that she had learned to recognize in dangerous men. But as their eyes met, something shifted in the space between them. For just a fraction of a second, Elena allowed him to see past the careful mask she had worn for so long. "Major Harrison," she said, and her voice carried a different quality now, something that made him take an unconscious step backward. "I think there might be a misunderstanding here." But Harrison was already committed to his course of action, already lost in the familiar script that had served him well before. He reached out, his hand moving toward her shoulder with the confident assumption that she would submit, would accept whatever he chose to take. Elena's response was so swift, so precisely calibrated, that for a moment Harrison couldn't process what had happened. One instant his hand was moving through empty air with casual confidence. The next he found himself doubled over, his wrist twisted at an angle that sent lightning bolts of pain shooting up his arm. The pen she had been holding was pressed against a very specific point on his neck, and her other hand had somehow found the nerve cluster just below his ear. "Please don't move, sir," she said conversationally, as if they were discussing weekend plans. "The pen is positioned over your carotid artery, and the pressure point I'm applying will cause some very unpleasant sensations if you struggle." Harrison tried to straighten, tried to use his size and strength to break free, but every movement only intensified the precise pain radiating from the points where Elena maintained contact. It was like being held by someone who understood his body better than he did, who could read the language of leverage and pressure with fluent expertise. "What?" he began, but Elena's grip tightened infinitesimally, and the words died in his throat. "I'm going to let you go now," she said, her voice still carrying that same measured calm. "And when I do, you're going to sit in that chair over there and listen very carefully to what I have to say. Are we clear?" The question was rhetorical. Harrison found himself nodding before he could stop himself, some primitive part of his brain recognizing that the fundamental power structure of the room had shifted in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Elena released him and stepped back, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she remained perfectly balanced, her weight distributed in a way that suggested she could move in any direction with equal speed. The transformation was so complete that Harrison wondered if he had somehow been transported into an entirely different room with an entirely different person. "Sit," she said, and he sat. The ceramic elephant watched from the desk, its painted eyes bright with secrets. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of illusion from a night that had started with such certainty and was ending with questions that no one had thought to ask before. Elena looked at the man who had terrorized her unit for years, who had used his rank and position to take what he wanted from those who couldn't fight back, and for the first time in 12 years of careful silence, she smiled. "Now then, Major," she said, settling against the edge of her desk with casual grace, "I think it's time we had a conversation about power." The alarm clock on Elena's nightstand had been chirping for exactly 3 minutes before she opened her eyes. Not because she had been asleep. Sleep was a luxury she had learned to live without, but because those 3 minutes were hers. In a life governed by regulations, formations, and the constant watchful presence of authority, those 180 seconds of manufactured unconsciousness were the only time that belonged entirely to her. Her quarters were austere even by military standards, A narrow bed with hospital corners sharp enough to cut glass, a small desk bearing only essential items, and a single window that looked out onto the parade ground where soldiers would soon begin their morning routines. But tucked into corners and hidden in plain sight were small tokens that told the story of Elena Vasquez, not the compliant communication specialist who had perfected the art of invisibility, but the woman who existed in the spaces between official notice. A photograph of her family sat propped against the base of her desk lamp, carefully positioned so that it was visible only from her bed. 5 faces smiled back at her, her parents stoic and proud in their Sunday clothes, her brother Miguel, grinning widely in his firefighter's uniform, her sister Carmen holding her newborn daughter, and Rosa, the baby of the family at 19, wearing the graduation cap that had represented 4 years of sacrifice from the entire Vasquez clan. Elena had sent most of her military pay home for over a decade, enabling Rosa's education, helping with Carmen's medical bills, supporting Miguel's transition from the streets to the fire department. The family letters that arrived monthly painted pictures of birthday parties and holidays, graduations and achievements, a vibrant life happening 3,000 miles away that felt both intimately connected to and completely separate from her existence on this base. She rose with the fluid grace of someone whose body had been honed into an instrument of precision, though not in the way her military instructors had intended. The push-ups and sit-ups that echoed through the barracks each morning were theater, performed with just enough competence to avoid attention, but never enough to suggest hidden capabilities. Her real training happened in the hours when others slept in empty gymnasiums and forgotten storage rooms, guided by knowledge that predated her military service by more than a decade. Elena's reflection in the small mirror above her sink showed a face that had learned to camouflage itself in camouflage itself. Plain sight. Her features were pleasant without being memorable, her expressions carefully calibrated to convey competence without ambition, reliability without distinction. It was a masterpiece of social engineering, crafted over years of observation and refinement. But this morning, as she braided her dark hair with automatic precision, she caught sight of something different in her own eyes. The encounter with Major Harrison had cracked something open, had allowed a glimpse of the person she had buried so deep that sometimes she forgot she existed at all. The mess hall buzzed with its usual morning energy, soldiers comparing weekend plans, discussing upcoming assignments, engaging in the ritualistic complaints that bonded military units together. Elena moved through the breakfast line with her customary efficiency, accepting the standard portions without comment or request for modification. She had learned that even food preferences could be interpreted as weakness or deviation from expected norms. "Elena, over here." Sergeant Jamie Martinez waved from a corner table, her smile genuine in a way that had become increasingly rare on the base. Jamie was newer to the unit, having arrived just 8 months ago with an optimism that had been worn down by the particular atmosphere that Major Harrison cultivated. She was also one of the few people who seemed to see Elena as an individual, rather than a fixture in the communications department. "How's the early shift treating you?" Jamie asked as Elena settled across from her. "I swear, you work more hours than the rest of us combined." "Someone has to monitor the overnight channels," Elena replied, but there was a warmth in her voice that she reserved for the few people who had earned it. Jamie reminded her of Rosa, in some ways enthusiastic, curious, still believing that the world was fundamentally fair and that good intentions would be rewarded with good outcomes. "Still, you've been here longer than almost anyone. Don't you ever think about transferring? Maybe somewhere with better leadership?" Jamie's question was carefully phrased, but Elena could hear the subtext. Even newcomers quickly learned to navigate around Major Harrison's particular brand of authority. Elena considered her response while she stirred her coffee. The truth was too complex for casual conversation, too layered with years of calculated decisions and carefully maintained cover stories. How could she explain that she had requested this assignment specifically because of its challenges? That sometimes the most effective way to protect others was to draw fire toward yourself? "I found my place here," she said finally. "Sometimes the work that matters most isn't the work that gets recognition." Jamie nodded, though Elena could see she didn't fully understand. Youth was like that, eager for visible progress, for achievements that could be measured and celebrated. Elena had been the same way once, before she learned that the most important victories often looked like defeats to outside observers. "Speaking of work," Jamie continued, lowering her voice, "did you hear about what happened to Specialist Morrison?" Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Morrison was a young woman, barely 21, who worked in the motor pool. She had been bright and eager when she arrived 6 months ago, full of plans for using her military training to build a career in automotive engineering. Lately, she had seemed increasingly withdrawn, jumping at unexpected sounds, avoiding eye contact with superior officers. What about her? Medical leave. Stress-related, they're saying, but... Jamie glanced around the mess hall, ensuring their conversation remained private. She was asking questions yesterday about transfer procedures. Seemed really shaken up. About something. Elena absorbed this information with the same careful attention she applied to intelligence reports. Morrison was the third young woman in 6 months to suddenly develop stress-related medical issues requiring extended leave. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to look for it, though the official reports would never reflect the true nature of the problem. "I hope she gets the help she needs," Elena said, and Jamie nodded earnestly, missing the deeper layers of meaning in the simple statement. After breakfast, Elena made her way to the communications center, passing through hallways lined with portraits of military heroes and inspirational quotes about service and sacrifice. The irony of those words, duty, honor, country, wasn't lost on someone who had spent 12 years watching those very ideals perverted by men who viewed their authority as license for predation. The morning briefing was led by Captain Reynolds, Harrison's second-in-command, and a man who had perfected the art of looking away at convenient moments. He distributed assignments with bureaucratic efficiency, his gaze sliding past Elena as if she were part of the furniture. It was a dismissal she had cultivated carefully, but this morning it felt different somehow. Less like successful camouflage, and more like willful blindness. "Vasquez, you'll be handling the overnight intelligence summaries again," Reynolds announced. "The colonel wants them ready for his 0800 briefing." "Yes, sir," Elena replied automatically. Another late night. Another opportunity for certain individuals to find reasons to check on her progress. The pattern was so established that she could have written the script herself, but as she settled at her workstation, surrounded by the familiar hum of electronic equipment, Elena found her thoughts drifting to the ceramic elephant on her desk. Rosa had chosen it specifically because elephants never forgot, she had explained. They remembered kindnesses and cruelties with equal clarity, and they protected their families with fierce loyalty. Elena opened her first intelligence report and began to read, but part of her mind was already planning. Major Harrison would return. Tonight men like him always did, interpreting any resistance as temporary rather than definitive. He would come expecting to find the same compliant woman he had tried to corner before, the same carefully constructed illusion of powerlessness that had protected so many others by drawing his attention to her instead. But Elena Vasquez had spent 12 years building something more complex than a simple disguise. She had created a perfect trap, baited with apparent vulnerability and designed to spring only when she was ready to handle the consequences. Tonight, she decided, would be the night to test whether all that patient preparation had been worth the cost. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, translating raw intelligence into actionable reports. But beneath the mundane surface of military bureaucracy, another kind of intelligence was being processed, the accumulated observations of a woman who had made herself invisible in order to see everything, who had appeared weak in order to grow strong unnoticed, who had spent more than a decade preparing for a confrontation that most people would have tried to avoid entirely. The ceramic elephant watched from its perch among the official papers, its trunk raised in eternal optimism, its painted eyes bright with secrets that were about to be revealed. The pattern revealed itself gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. Elena had spent years cataloging the small signs, the way certain women suddenly requested transfers, the medical leaves that followed closed-door meetings, the gradual erosion of confidence she witnessed in young soldiers who had arrived bright-eyed and eager to serve their country. Specialist Katie Morrison had been the latest casualty, but she was far from the first. Elena kept mental files on each incident, stored away in the part of her mind that never stopped analyzing, never stopped, preparing for the moment when all that accumulated evidence would finally serve its purpose. 3 weeks after the encounter in the communications room, Elena found Morrison in the base laundry facility at 0300 hours, sitting on the floor between 2 industrial washing machines, crying with the kind of desperate silence that spoke of practiced concealment. The young woman's service uniform was rumpled, her blonde hair escaping its regulation bun in ways that would have earned demerits during inspection. "Katie?" Elena's voice was soft, careful not to startle someone who was clearly operating on the edge of panic. Morrison looked up, her eyes wide with the particular terror of being discovered in a vulnerable moment. "Sergeant Vasquez, I was just ... You were doing laundry," Elena supplied gently, settling onto the floor beside her. The concrete was cold through her utility pants, but she made no acknowledgement of discomfort. "Same as me. These machines run quieter at night." It was a transparent fiction, but it offered Morrison a lifeline of dignity, a way to exist in this moment without having to explain or justify her presence. Elena waited, letting the rhythmic sounds of washing machines and distant generators fill the space between them. He said ... Morrison began, then stopped, her hands twisting the fabric of her shirt into tight spirals. He said no one would believe me, that I was just a specialist and he's a major, that I'd already shown poor judgment by being alone with him. Elena's expression didn't change, but something cold and sharp crystallized in her chest. The script was always the same: isolation, implied consent, institutional protection for the predator. It was a system that had been refined over generations, perfected through repetition until it operated with mechanical precision. "Tell me," Elena said simply. The story that emerged was depressingly familiar. Morrison had been called to Major Harrison's office to discuss a commendation for her work on a particularly challenging vehicle repair. The meeting had started professionally, with praise for her technical skills and discussion of advancement opportunities. Then Harrison had moved closer, had made comments about her appearance, had suggested that certain career benefits might be available to soldiers who demonstrated special appreciation for their commanding officers. When Morrison had tried to leave, Harrison had positioned himself between her and the door. When she had attempted to redirect the conversation back to professional matters, he had become increasingly aggressive, more explicit in his suggestions, more physical in his approach. The encounter had ended with Morrison's panicked agreement to think about his proposals and his casual reminder that military careers could be destroyed as easily as they were built. "I thought about reporting it," Morrison whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical sounds surrounding them. "But then I started asking questions about the process, and Captain Reynolds made it clear that accusations against senior officers were taken very seriously, that false reports could result in court-martial." Elena nodded, unsurprised. Reynolds was Harrison's enabler, the bureaucratic shield that transformed predation into policy. He specialized in asking leading questions that suggested accusers were unstable, in finding procedural reasons to dismiss complaints before they could gain traction, in creating paper trails that portrayed victims as troublemakers and their abusers as misunderstood leaders dealing with difficult subordinates. What do you want to do? Elena asked. Morrison looked at her with surprise, as if the question had never occurred to her. I want to transfer, get as far away from here as possible. Start over somewhere else, and let him do this to someone else? The words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight that made Morrison flinch. Elena watched emotions play across the younger woman's face: guilt, anger, fear, and underneath it all, a stubborn core of integrity that hadn't quite been crushed yet. What else can I do? You've been here 12 years. You know how this works. The system protects people like him, not people like us. Elena considered her response carefully. Morrison was right about the system, but she was wrong about their options. There were always alternatives for people willing to think beyond official channels. For those who understood that sometimes justice required creativity, the system protects him because he's learned to use it effectively. Elena said finally, but every system has vulnerabilities. Every predator has patterns, and patterns can be disrupted by people who understand them well enough. Over the next hour, Elena listened as Morrison described not just her own experience, but observations about other women in the unit. She spoke of Specialist Chun, who had requested emergency leave after a late-night inventory review with the Major, of Corporal Williams, who had developed a mysterious anxiety disorder that required medication and eventually led to early discharge. Of Private Rodriguez, who had been transferred to a remote posting in Alaska after making unfounded accusations against a superior officer. Each story added another piece to a puzzle Elena had been assembling for years. Harrison's method was sophisticated in its simplicity. He targeted women who were isolated, ambitious, or vulnerable in some way. He used his authority to create opportunities for private encounters, then escalated gradually, testing boundaries and building a sense of complicity in his victims. When resistance appeared, he deployed the institutional machinery that transformed survivors into problems to be managed rather than crimes to be investigated. There's something else, Morrison said as their conversation neared its end. A few weeks ago, I was working late in the motor pool when I heard voices from the maintenance office. The Major was there with someone, couldn't see who, but I heard him talking about documentation. Something about keeping detailed records for insurance purposes. Elena's attention sharpened. What kind of records? I don't know exactly. But he mentioned photos, audio recordings, personal information about his targets. He called it maintaining operational security. The implication sent ice through Elena's veins. Harrison wasn't just a predator. He was a predator who documented his activities, who created evidence of his crimes as leverage against his victims. It was a level of calculation that suggested years of experience, systematic planning, and absolute confidence in his immunity from consequences. Katie, Elena said, her voice carrying new urgency, I need you to think very carefully about what you heard. Every detail could be important. Morrison closed her eyes, concentrating. He mentioned a storage unit, off base, somewhere in town. Said it was better than keeping sensitive materials where they might be discovered during routine inspections. Elena filed this information away with the methodical precision of an intelligence analyst building a case. Storage unit meant off-base jurisdiction, civilian law enforcement, potential evidence that existed outside military control. It also meant Harrison was more vulnerable than he realized, had created weaknesses in his own security through the same arrogance that made him believe himself untouchable. What happens now? Morrison asked. Elena stood, extending a hand to help the younger woman to her feet. Now you decide what kind of soldier you want to be. The kind who runs from problems, or the kind who faces them. But you said yourself that the system protects him. The military system does, Elena agreed. But there are other systems, other kinds of accountability. And sometimes the most effective way to protect future victims is to ensure that predators face consequences that matter to them. Over the following days, Elena began reaching out to other women in ways that appeared casual but were anything but random. A shared coffee break with Sergeant Lisa Park, who had requested transfer 6 months earlier after a series of performance reviews that had left her shaken and demoralized. A conversation in the gym with Corporal Maria Santos, who had developed insomnia and hypervigilance after being selected for special assignments that invariably required working alone with Major Harrison. Each woman's story added texture to the pattern Elena was documenting, but more importantly, each conversation planted seeds of possibility. What if they weren't isolated? What if their experiences were part of a larger picture that could be exposed and addressed? What if there were ways to seek justice that didn't require trusting the system designed to protect their abuser? Elena also began conducting her own reconnaissance, using her access to communication systems to research civilian law enforcement procedures, victim advocacy resources, and investigative journalists who specialized in military misconduct cases. She mapped the network of relationships that kept Harrison protected, identifying key figures and potential pressure points. The work was dangerous in ways that went beyond personal risk. Elena was operating in violation of military regulations about information security, chain of command, and proper channels for addressing grievances. If discovered, she could face court-martial, imprisonment, and the destruction of everything she had built over 12 years of service. But as she watched Morrison gradually regain some measure of confidence, as she saw other women begin to connect with each other and share their experiences, Elena knew she had made the right choice. Some fights were worth the risk, and some silences were more dangerous than the loudest accusations. Major Harrison, meanwhile, had become increasingly aggressive in his attention toward Elena herself. Their encounter in the communications room had clearly unsettled him, but rather than retreating, he had doubled down on his pursuit. Late-night visits to check on her work became more frequent, his questions more personal, his physical proximity more deliberate. "You know, Elena," he said during one such encounter, positioning himself between her and the exit in a move she recognized from Morrison's description, "I've been thinking about what happened the other night. I might have misread the situation." Elena continued typing, her fingers steady on the keyboard, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "What situation was that, sir? Come now. We both know what I'm talking about. Your ... reaction was unexpected, but I respect that. Shows character." The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound reasonable while carrying an undercurrent of threat. Elena recognized the technique: reframe aggression as misunderstanding, position predation. As romance, make the victim complicit in her own victimization. "I'm not sure I follow, sir," she replied, matching his casual tone while her peripheral vision tracked his position and mapped potential responses. Harrison moved closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "I think you're smarter than you let on, Elena. Stronger, too. That's attractive." The word attractive carried the weight of 12 years of accumulated authority, of institutional protection, of absolute confidence that resistance was temporary and submission inevitable. But it also carried something else, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. A crack in the facade that suggested Elena's earlier demonstration had lodged more deeply in his consciousness than he wanted to admit. "Sir, I need to finish these reports," Elena said, her tone remaining professional despite the situation escalating around her. "The reports can wait." Harrison's hand moved toward her shoulder, following the same script that had worked with Morrison and countless others before her. This time, Elena didn't respond with the swift violence that had caught him off guard before. Instead, she turned in her chair with deliberate slowness, meeting his gaze with an expression that was calm, measuring, and completely unafraid. "Major Harrison," she said quietly, I think you should reconsider what you're doing. Something in. Her voice made him pause, made him recognize that this interaction was not following his familiar script. Elena looked like the same compliant communications specialist she had always appeared to be. But beneath the surface, something had shifted in ways that his predatory instincts couldn't quite categorize. Is that a threat, Sergeant? It's an observation, sir. You're standing very close to someone who doesn't want you there. You're making assumptions about consent that aren't supported by evidence. And you're doing it in a room with recording equipment that's always active. Harrison's gaze flicked involuntarily to the various monitoring devices that surrounded them, equipment he had never considered as potential witnesses to his actions. Elena watched him process this new information, saw the moment when his confidence faltered just slightly. You wouldn't, he said, but there was a question in his voice now where there had been only certainty before. Elena smiled, and for the first time in their acquaintance, the expression held no trace of submission or accommodation. Major, I think you're about to discover just how much you don't know about me. The evidence arrived on Colonel Patricia Reeves' desk at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who provided no identification beyond a simple statement. From concerned service members who believe in the values our uniform represents. Colonel Reeves had commanded Fort Davidson for 18 months, long enough to understand the complex dynamics that governed military installations, but not long enough to have become complicit in the systems that enabled abuse. She was a career officer who had risen through the ranks by combining tactical brilliance with an inflexible moral code, earning respect through competence rather than political maneuvering. The manila envelope contained 43 pages of meticulously documented evidence, personnel files showing patterns of transfers and medical discharges among young female soldiers, audio recordings of conversations where Major Harrison discussed his methods for maintaining discipline among difficult subordinates, photographs recovered from his off-base storage unit, showing personal effects that belonged to women who had never consented to having their private moments documented. But most damning of all was a detailed timeline that connected each incident to specific policy changes Harrison had implemented, showing how he had systematically modified duty rosters, inspection procedures, and performance evaluation protocols to create opportunities for predation while insulating himself from accountability. Colonel Reeves read through the materials twice, her expression growing progressively more grim. Then she reached for her secure phone and made a series of calls that would reshape the command structure of Fort Davidson within the next 72 hours. Elena was conducting routine maintenance on the communication arrays when the military police arrived at Major Harrison's quarters. She watched through her window as Harrison was escorted across the parade ground in restraints, his usual swagger replaced by the uncertain gait of a man whose world had suddenly become unpredictable. The arrest sent shockwaves through the base. Harrison had been a fixture for almost 5 years, a man who commanded respect through fear and who had seemed untouchable in his authority. Soldiers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, trying to process the implications of seeing their commanding officer reduced to just another criminal defendant. Holy shit, Sergeant Martinez whispered as she joined Elena at the window. I mean, I knew he was a bastard, but I never thought. You never thought someone would finally hold him accountable, Elena finished gently. Did you know this was coming? Elena considered her response carefully. The investigation that had brought down Harrison was ostensibly the work of military law enforcement, responding to anonymous tips, but the reality was more complex. Someone had provided investigators with information that was too detailed, too precisely targeted, to have come from casual observation. Someone had guided the investigation with surgical precision, ensuring that evidence was preserved and witnesses were protected. I knew something had to give eventually, she said finally. Men like Harrison always overreach eventually. They start believing their own invincibility. Over the next week, as investigators conducted interviews and reviewed evidence, the full scope of Harrison's activities began to emerge. 12 women had been directly victimized over a period of 3 years. 7 had left the military entirely, their careers derailed by trauma they couldn't officially acknowledge. 3 others had been transferred to remote postings after making complaints that were systematically dismissed. Elena found herself called for interview on a Thursday afternoon, sitting across from Captain Sarah Kim, a military police investigator with kind eyes and a reputation for thoroughness. The room was deliberately informal, comfortable chairs, adequate lighting, a box of tissues placed discreetly within reach. "Sergeant Vasquez, thank you for coming in. I know this has been a difficult time for everyone in the unit." "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to ask you about your interactions with Major Harrison over the past several years. Take your time, and please know that this conversation is being recorded for accuracy, but that you have rights as both a witness and a service member." Elena had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed her responses to balance truth-telling with operational security. Too much knowledge would raise questions about how she had obtained it. Too little would miss the opportunity to provide context that investigators needed. "My interactions with Major Harrison were primarily professional," she began. "As the senior communications specialist, I often worked extended hours and had occasion to brief him on overnight intelligence reports. Did these interactions ever become inappropriate? There were occasions when Major Harrison made comments that seemed unprofessional. Personal remarks about my appearance or my dedication to duty that felt uncomfortable." Captain Kim nodded, making notes. "Did he ever make physical contact that you considered inappropriate?" Elena paused, appearing to consider the question carefully. "There was one incident, approximately 3 weeks ago. Major Harrison visited the communications room during a late shift and became increasingly personal in his conversation. When I attempted to redirect the discussion to professional matters, he became agitated and attempted to make physical contact. Can you describe what happened?" "He reached for my shoulder in a way that felt threatening. I responded by immobilizing him temporarily and explaining that his behavior was unwelcome. He left shortly afterward." Captain Kim's pen stopped moving. "You immobilized him?" "I have some training in self-defense. Nothing elaborate, just basic techniques for protecting oneself in dangerous situations." The investigator leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant, Major Harrison is a significantly larger man with military combat training. What kind of self-defense background allows a person to immobilize someone like that?" Elena met her gaze steadily. "The kind that prioritizes technique over strength, ma'am. Most attackers expect their victims to panic or freeze. When that doesn't happen, they're often at a disadvantage." It was a careful non-answer that acknowledged capability without revealing its full extent. Captain Kim studied Elena's face for several long moments, clearly recognizing that there were layers to the story that weren't being disclosed. "Is there anything else about your interactions with Major Harrison that you think investigators should know?" "I believe Major Harrison targeted women he perceived as vulnerable or isolated. In my case, he may have mistaken my professional competence for personal weakness. When that assessment proved incorrect, he appeared surprised." The interview concluded with routine questions about Elena's observations of Harrison's interactions with other soldiers, her awareness of any complaints or concerns, and her assessment of the overall climate within the unit. Elena provided careful, measured responses that painted a picture of systemic dysfunction, without revealing the extent of her own investigation. As she left the interview room, Elena encountered Specialist Morrison in the hallway, clearly waiting for her own interview. The young woman looked nervous but determined, her posture straighter than Elena had seen it in months. "Sergeant Vasquez," Morrison said quietly, "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For helping me remember that I'm stronger than I thought I was." Elena smiled, recognizing an echo of Rose's words about the ceramic elephant. You were always strong, Katie. You just needed a reminder. The investigation moved with unprecedented speed and thoroughness. Within 2 weeks, investigators had interviewed 37 current and former personnel, recovered digital evidence from Harrison's personal devices, and executed search warrants on his off-base storage facilities. The evidence they uncovered painted a picture of systematic predation that went far beyond individual misconduct. Harrison had maintained detailed files on his victims, including photographs taken without consent, recordings of private conversations, and personal information gathered through abuse of his security clearance. He had used this material not just for personal gratification, but as leverage to ensure silence and compliance. Several women had endured ongoing harassment for months or years after their initial victimization, trapped by the threat of exposure. More disturbing still was the discovery that Harrison's activities had been enabled by a network of complicit officers who had systematically dismissed complaints, transferred accusers, and protected their colleague through bureaucratic manipulation. Captain Reynolds faced charges for obstruction of justice and dereliction of duty. 3 other officers were relieved of command. Pending investigation, the broader implications sent tremors through the entire military justice system. Congressional representatives began asking pointed questions about oversight procedures. Victim advocacy groups demanded reform of reporting processes. Media attention focused on institutional failures that had allowed predators to operate with impunity. Elena watched these developments with satisfaction tempered by realism. Harrison's downfall was a victory, but it was also just one battle in a much larger war. For every predator who faced consequences, others remained protected by systems that prioritized institutional reputation over individual justice. But there were also encouraging signs of change. Colonel Reeves implemented new policies that required multiple officers to approve late-night duty assignments, created anonymous reporting mechanisms that bypassed traditional chains of command, and established victim advocacy positions staffed by personnel specifically trained to support survivors of sexual assault and harassment. More importantly, the women who had survived Harrison's abuse began connecting with each other in ways that created mutual support networks. Morrison organized informal gatherings where survivors could share resources and coping strategies. Park developed a mentorship program that paired experienced soldiers with newcomers to help them navigate the challenges of military life. Santos volunteered with off-base organizations that provided counseling and legal assistance to military personnel. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Some soldiers remained skeptical of reporting mechanisms, convinced that the changes were cosmetic rather than substantive. Others worried that speaking out would still result in career damage despite official protections. The culture of silence that had protected predators for generations wouldn't disappear overnight, but Elena could see the foundations shifting in ways that mattered. Young soldiers were asking questions about policies and procedures that had previously been accepted without challenge. Senior leaders were being held accountable for the climates they created within their commands. Most importantly, survivors were beginning to understand that they had allies, that their experiences were believed and validated, that seeking justice was possible even within imperfect systems. 3 months after Harrison's arrest, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Captain Kim appeared at her desk one afternoon carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression that suggested this wasn't an official visit. "Sergeant Vasquez, do you have a moment for an informal conversation?" Elena saved her work and gestured to a nearby chair. Captain Kim had concluded her official investigation weeks earlier, but something in her demeanor suggested this meeting had different purposes. "I wanted to thank you," Kim began. "Your testimony was instrumental in helping us understand the scope of Major Harrison's activities." "I just answered your questions honestly, ma'am." "Yes, you did. But you also provided context that helped us ask better questions of other witnesses. Your insights into Harrison's methods were Remarkably perceptive. Elena waited, recognizing that this conversation was building towards something specific. I've been investigating military sexual assault cases for 7 years, Kim continued. I've seen a lot of survivors, a lot of witnesses, a lot of people trying to navigate impossible situations. But I've never encountered someone quite like you. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you do. Kim leaned forward slightly. Most victims of attempted assault focus on their own trauma, their own healing. It's natural and understandable. But you seemed more concerned with preventing future victims, with building cases that would hold up in court, with protecting other women who might be targeted. Elena remained silent, unsure where this line of inquiry was leading. It made me curious about your background before the military. So I did some research. The words sent ice through Elena's veins, but she kept her expression neutral. Her pre-military life was carefully compartmentalized, protected by classification levels that most investigators couldn't access. Elena Vasquez, born in Los Angeles, eldest of 4 children. Parents worked multiple jobs to support the family. Scholarship student at UCLA, degree in computer science with a minor in criminal justice. But what's interesting is what happened during your junior year. Kim paused, watching Elena's face for reactions that didn't come. You took a leave of absence. Official records show medical reasons, but medical records from that period are sealed. When you returned to school, your academic focus had shifted significantly. More courses in psychology, sociology, criminology. Almost as if you were preparing for a different kind of career than computer programming. Elena's mind raced through possible responses, calculating how much truth she could reveal without compromising operations that extended far beyond this single case. People change direction in college, she said carefully. It's not uncommon. No, it's not. But most people who change direction don't then enlist in the military with specialized skills that aren't reflected in any official training records. Most people who immobilize trained combat officers don't learn those techniques in basic self-defense classes. The investigation had reached the edges of Elena's cover story, probing areas that required careful navigation. Too much resistance would raise additional questions. Too much cooperation might reveal information that could endanger other operations. Captain Kim, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I'm not sure what you're suggesting. Kim smiled, and for the first time in their acquaintance, the expression seemed genuinely warm rather than professionally courteous. I'm suggesting that Major Harrison picked the wrong target. I'm suggesting that sometimes justice requires people with specialized skills to operate in ways that aren't entirely conventional. And I'm suggesting that whatever your real background is, I'm grateful it led you to protect the women in this unit. Elena studied the investigator's face, recognizing someone who understood that official channels weren't always sufficient to address systematic problems, that sometimes effective law enforcement required flexibility and creativity. I'm also suggesting, Kim continued, that if you ever decide you want a career change, there are federal agencies that could use someone with your particular combination of skills and moral clarity. She placed a business card on Elena's desk, not her official MP card, but something else entirely. The name was the same, but the agency identifier was one Elena recognized from her pre-military life. Think about it, Kim said, standing to leave. In the meantime, keep doing whatever it is you're doing. The military needs more people like you, even if they don't always know it. Elena waited until Kim had left before examining the business card more closely. The agency listed was one she had worked with before, during those missing months of her junior year that Captain Kim had identified. It was also an agency that recruited from unusual backgrounds, that valued people who could operate effectively in gray areas between official and unofficial action. The offer represented a path back to work she had set aside when family obligations required the steady income and benefits of military service. It was also a recognition that her current cover was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, that her skills had been revealed in ways that would make future operations challenging. But as Elena looked around the communications room where she had spent 12 years building relationships and gathering intelligence, she realized that her work here wasn't finished. Harrison's downfall had created opportunities for broader change, chances to address systemic problems that extended beyond one predatory officer. She tucked the business card into her wallet, filing it away as a future possibility while focusing on present responsibilities. Outside her window, the base was settling into evening routines, soldiers moving through familiar patterns with the unconscious precision of long practice. But beneath the surface of that familiar rhythm, something fundamental had shifted. Women walked with straighter spines, spoke with clearer voices, looked their superior officers in the eye with newfound confidence. The culture of fear that had dominated this installation for years was beginning to crack, replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. Elena opened her laptop and began typing her nightly intelligence summary, but her mind was already planning her next move. There were other installations, other predators, other systems that needed someone willing to work patiently from within to create opportunities for justice. The ceramic elephant watched from its perch, trunk raised in eternal optimism, eyes bright with secrets that were no longer quite so secret. Some victories, Elena reflected, were worth 12 years of careful preparation. 6 months after Major Harrison's court-martial conviction and sentencing to 15 years in military prison, Fort Davidson had become something unprecedented in Elena's experience, a military installation where women served without the constant undercurrent of fear that had defined the previous era. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Cultural change in military environments required sustained effort, consistent leadership, and the kind of institutional commitment that could survive personnel rotations and budget cycles. But under Colonel Reeves' command, supported by a cadre of officers who understood that military effectiveness depended on unit cohesion rather than authoritarian intimidation, real progress was becoming visible. Elena found herself in an unexpected position. Her role in bringing down Harrison had elevated her profile within the unit, earning recognition that she had spent 12 years carefully avoiding. Soldiers who had previously seen her as simply competent now sought her advice on professional matters. Younger women, in particular, seemed to view her as a mentor figure, someone who had proven that resistance was possible even within hierarchical systems. Sergeant Vasquez. Private Jennifer Walsh appeared at Elena's workstation, holding a clipboard and wearing the slightly nervous expression of someone asking for guidance from a superior they respected. "Could I speak with you about something?" Elena gestured to a nearby chair, recognizing Walsh as one of the newest arrivals to the communications unit. At 19, she possessed the earnest enthusiasm that Elena remembered from her own early military service, combined with a technical aptitude that had already earned her commendations for innovative problem-solving. "What's on your mind, Walsh?" "It's about my assignment schedule. I've been selected for additional duties that require working late shifts alone with Lieutenant Crawford. He's been professional, but there's something about the way he looks at me that makes me uncomfortable." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Crawford was new to the unit, having transferred in after Harrison's arrest as part of the broader personnel reshuffling. He was young, ambitious, and had quickly established himself as someone who paid particular attention to the female soldiers under his command. "Tell me about these additional duties," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. Walsh described assignments that followed a pattern Elena recognized: unnecessary equipment inspections, redundant security briefings, tasks that could easily be completed during regular duty hours, but were instead scheduled for times when oversight would be minimal and isolation would be complete. "Walsh, Have you mentioned your concerns to anyone else? I tried talking to Sergeant Morrison about it, but she said I might be overreacting. That after everything that happened with Major Harrison, maybe we're all just more sensitive to normal military interactions. Elena understood Morrison's reluctance to acknowledge potential problems. Survivors of sexual assault often struggled with questions about their own judgment, wondered if trauma had made them paranoid or unable to distinguish between actual threats and innocent behavior. It was a rational response to an irrational situation, but it could also leave them vulnerable to predators who understood how to exploit that self-doubt. What does your instinct tell you? Elena asked. Walsh considered the question seriously. My instinct tells me that Lieutenant Crawford is testing boundaries, seeing how far he can push before I object. But my logical mind says that maybe I'm being unfair, that he hasn't actually done anything wrong yet. Both things can be true, Elena said gently. Your instincts can be accurate about someone's intentions, even when their actions haven't yet crossed clear lines. The question is what you want to do with that information. Over the next hour, Elena helped Walsh analyze her situation using skills that had taken Elena years to develop. They discussed documentation strategies, ways to create paper trails that would support any future complaints. They identified potential allies, other soldiers who might serve as witnesses or advocates. Most importantly, they developed a response plan that would allow Walsh to address escalating behavior without waiting for it to become criminal. The most important thing to remember, Elena explained, is that your safety and well-being matter more than anyone's feelings about being accused of inappropriate behavior. If someone is genuinely innocent, they'll understand why you needed to set boundaries. If they're not innocent, they'll try to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. The conversation with Walsh crystallized something Elena had been considering. For months, Harrison's downfall had created a temporary deterrent effect, but institutional memory was short, and new predators would inevitably attempt to fill the vacuum left by his removal. Sustainable change required more than punishment after the fact. It required education, preparation, and empowerment of potential targets. Elena began developing what she privately called survival education, informal mentoring sessions where she shared knowledge that wasn't part of official military training. She taught young soldiers how to recognize grooming behaviors, how to document inappropriate conduct, how to seek help through both official and unofficial channels. Most importantly, she helped them understand that they had agency, that they weren't powerless victims waiting for someone else to protect them. The work was delicate, requiring careful balance between practical preparation and paranoid hypervigilance. Elena didn't want to create an atmosphere where every interaction with male authority figures was viewed with suspicion, but she also wanted young women to understand the realities of military culture and their options for self-protection. You know, Specialist Morrison observed during one of these informal gatherings, a year ago, I never would have imagined having conversations like this. I would have thought it was disloyal or something. It's not disloyal to prepare for potential problems, Elena replied. It's professional. Male soldiers receive training on combat situations they might never encounter. Why shouldn't female soldiers receive training on threats that statistics suggest they probably will encounter? The group was meeting in the base recreation center, ostensibly as a book club, actually as a forum for sharing experiences and strategies. 8 women attended regularly, ranging from Private Walsh to Staff Sergeant Chun, who had returned from medical leave with a newfound commitment to ensuring other women didn't hear what she had experienced. What I still don't understand, said Corporal Martinez, is how Elena knew so much about Harrison's methods. I mean, we all saw what he was doing, but Elena seemed to understand the pattern in ways that helped investigators build their case. Elena had anticipated this question and prepared responses that balanced honesty with operational security. Pattern recognition is part of intelligence work. When you spend years analyzing information for threats and vulnerabilities, you develop skills that apply to other situations. It was true as far as it went, though it didn't explain the specialized training that had enabled her to neutralize Harrison's physical advantage, or the investigative techniques that had guided her evidence collection, or the psychological insights that had helped her understand his victim selection criteria. Still, Martinez continued, it was like you were playing chess while the rest of us were playing checkers. Makes me wonder what other skills you've got that aren't in your official record. Elena smiled, recognizing good-natured curiosity without any genuine suspicion. We all have more capabilities than our official records reflect. The question is whether we're willing to use them when circumstances require it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Rodriguez, the new unit commander who had replaced Harrison. Rodriguez was a 34-year-old officer with combat experience in 3 different theaters and a reputation for innovative leadership strategies. More importantly, she was a woman who understood both the challenges and opportunities presented by leading a unit that had undergone significant trauma. Sorry to interrupt, Rodriguez said, but I wanted to update everyone on some policy changes that will be implemented next month. The updates were substantial and encouraging. New regulations required multiple officers to approve any assignment. That involved soldiers working alone with superiors of different ranks. Anonymous reporting mechanisms had been expanded to include civilian oversight representatives. Most significantly, the base was implementing a pilot program for peer advocacy-trained volunteers who could provide support and guidance to soldiers dealing with harassment or assault. We're also going to be hosting a visit from Senator Patricia Murray's Oversight Committee, Rodriguez announced. They're conducting a broader investigation into military sexual assault prevention programs, and Fort Davidson has been selected as an example of effective institutional response. Elena felt a mixture of pride and concern. Recognition was gratifying, but it also brought attention that could complicate ongoing operations. High-profile visits meant increased scrutiny, more detailed background checks, and potential exposure of information that was meant to remain classified. After the meeting ended and other soldiers had departed, Captain Rodriguez approached Elena privately. Sergeant, I wanted to thank you personally for your role in recent events. I know the official record doesn't fully capture your contributions, but I want you to know that your work has been noticed at levels well above this installation. I appreciate that, ma'am, but I was just doing my job. Were you? Rodriguez's question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Because from what I've been told, your job was communications specialist, not criminal investigator or victim advocate. Yet somehow you managed to be remarkably effective at both. Elena recognized that Rodriguez, like Captain Kim before her, was probing at the edges of her cover story. It was a hazard of successful operations. Competence inevitably attracted attention from people trained to notice unusual capabilities. Ma'am, military service requires adaptability. We all develop skills that aren't explicitly part of our job descriptions. Rodriguez nodded slowly. That's true. But not everyone develops them to the same extent or applies them as effectively. It makes me curious about what other challenges might benefit from your particular type of adaptability. The conversation carried implications that extended beyond Fort Davidson's boundaries. Rodriguez wasn't just acknowledging Elena's past contributions. She was suggesting future collaboration on problems that might require unconventional approaches. Are there specific challenges you had in mind? Elena asked carefully. Several, actually. The military is a large organization with complex problems. Sexual assault and harassment are just one category of institutional dysfunction that might benefit from creative solutions. Elena understood that she was being recruited for something, though the exact nature of that something remained unclear. Rodriguez represented a new generation of military leadership officers who had come of age during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, who understood that complex problems required flexible thinking and weren't constrained by traditional approaches to military hierarchy. "I'd be interested in learning more about these challenges," Elena said finally. "I thought you might be. We'll be in touch." That evening, Elena sat in her quarters reviewing the events of the day and the implications for her future. The business card from Captain Kim remained in her wallet, representing one possible path forward. Rodriguez's recruitment suggested another, but both options required her to abandon the careful anonymity that had defined her military service. She picked up the ceramic elephant from her desk, studying its cheerful colors and optimistic expression. Rosa had chosen it because elephants never forgot, but she had also mentioned that elephants were known for their protective instincts, their willingness to defend their families against any threat. Elena had spent 12 years protecting women. She barely knew by drawing dangerous attention toward herself and away from more vulnerable targets. The work had been necessary and effective, but it had also been isolating, requiring her to maintain careful distances from the people she was trying to protect. Now, for the first time since joining the military, she found herself part of a community that valued her contributions and understood, at least partially, who she really was. The young women who sought her mentorship weren't just beneficiaries of her protection. They were becoming partners in creating systemic change. The transformation at Fort Davidson was real and sustainable, but it was also fragile. Cultural change required constant reinforcement, especially in institutions with high personnel turnover and deeply embedded traditions. The work she had started here needed continuation, expansion, and adaptation to new challenges. Elena opened her laptop and began typing an email to Captain Kim, accepting the offer to discuss career opportunities with federal agencies. Then she deleted it and started over, this time composing a message to Captain Rodriguez, expressing interest in learning more about unconventional approaches to institutional problems. She deleted that one too. Instead, she opened a new document and began writing something different as a proposal for expanding the mentorship and education programs that had emerged organically from her work with individual soldiers. It was a plan that would institutionalize the informal networks they had created, that would ensure future soldiers received the knowledge and support necessary to protect themselves and their colleagues. The proposal was ambitious, requiring resources and official sanction that might be difficult to obtain. But it was also practical, building on demonstrated successes and addressing documented needs. Most importantly, it was something she could pursue while maintaining her current position and continuing the work that had brought her to Fort Davidson. In the first place, Elena worked through the night, refining ideas and building detailed implementation strategies. By morning, she had created a comprehensive program that could serve as a model for military installations worldwide, a legacy that would extend far beyond her individual service. The ceramic elephant watched over her work, trunk raised in eternal optimism, eyes bright with the knowledge that some forms of strength were measured not in dominance, but in the courage to stand between predators and their prey. Year after year, until systemic change made such courage less necessary. 3 years later, the auditorium at the Pentagon buzzed with quiet conversations as military personnel from across the globe gathered for the annual Military Sexual Assault Prevention Conference. Representatives from 37 installations sat in carefully arranged rows, notebooks ready, minds focused on learning from programs that had demonstrated measurable success in creating cultural change. Elena adjusted her dress uniform one final time before stepping up to the podium. The transformation from communications specialist to program director had required her to develop new skills: public speaking, bureaucratic navigation, and the particular art of presenting radical ideas in ways that seemed reasonable to conservative institutions. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. 3 years ago, Fort Davidson had one of the highest rates of sexual assault and harassment in the military. Today, it has one of the lowest. I'm here to explain how that transformation happened and how you can implement similar changes at your installations. The presentation that followed was built on years of careful documentation, statistical analysis, and real-world experience. Elena described the mentorship networks that had evolved from informal conversations into structured support systems. She explained the peer advocacy program that had trained hundreds of soldiers to recognize grooming behaviors and intervene effectively. Most importantly, she detailed the cultural shift that had occurred when potential victims stopped viewing themselves as helpless targets and began understanding themselves as active agents of change. The traditional approach to preventing sexual assault focuses on punishment after the fact, Elena explained, clicking through slides that showed comparative data from multiple installations. Our approach focuses on prevention through education and empowerment. We teach potential targets to recognize danger early and respond effectively. We create support networks that make predators' preferred tactics, isolation and intimidation, much more difficult to employ. In the third row, Specialist Walsh, now Sergeant Walsh, took notes with the same careful attention she had brought to their early conversations about Lieutenant Crawford. Crawford had indeed escalated his behavior, but Walsh had been prepared. Her documentation was thorough, her response was swift, and the intervention was successful before any serious harm occurred. Crawford was transferred and received counseling. Walsh received a commendation for her professional handling of a difficult situation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Questions? Elena asked as her presentation concluded. A colonel from Fort Bragg raised his hand. Sergeant Vasquez, this all sounds very impressive, but how do you measure the effectiveness of prevention? How do you prove that assaults didn't happen because of your program rather than because of other factors? Elena had anticipated this question. Military culture valued quantifiable results, measurable outcomes, statistical proof of success. Sir, we measure effectiveness through multiple metrics. Reported incidents have decreased by 73% over 3 years. Anonymous surveys show increased confidence in reporting mechanisms and support systems. Retention rates among female personnel have improved significantly. But perhaps most importantly, we measure cultural change through qualitative indicators, the way soldiers talk about these issues, the speed with which problems are identified and addressed, the level of peer support available to potential victims. Another hand rose. What about false accusations? Are you concerned that your training might lead to increased reports against innocent personnel? Elena met the questioner's gaze steadily. Sir, our data shows that false accusation rates have remained consistent with historical norms, approximately 2 to 3% of total reports. Meanwhile, actual reporting has increased substantially, suggesting that our programs are primarily encouraging previously silent victims to seek help rather than generating false claims. The questions continued for 30 minutes, covering implementation, challenges, resource requirements, and scalability issues. Elena answered each one with the competence that had earned her this platform, drawing on experience that extended far beyond her official credentials. As the session concluded, Elena was approached by a familiar figure, Captain Kim, now Major. Kim, wearing the uniform of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. Outstanding presentation, Kim said, extending her hand. I've been following your work with great interest. Thank you, ma'am. I've tried to build on the foundation that your investigation established. You've done much more than that. You've created something unprecedented, a systematic approach to preventing military sexual assault that actually works. There are people in Washington who are very interested in expanding your model. Elena nodded, recognizing the careful language of someone discussing classified possibilities in public settings. Over the past 3 years, she had been approached multiple times by various agencies interested in her unique combination of skills and experience. Each conversation had been more specific than the last, more focused on particular problems that required unconventional solutions. "I'm committed to the work here," Elena replied. "We're just beginning to see the long-term effects of cultural change." "I understand. But consider this, Fort Davidson has become a model that's being replicated globally. Your work here is sustainable and scalable. That creates opportunities for you to address similar problems in other contexts." Major Kim handed Elena a folder marked with security classifications that indicated its contents were significantly more sensitive than typical career guidance materials. "When you're ready for the next challenge, there are people who would very much like to discuss how your expertise might apply to other institutional problems." Elena accepted the folder, understanding that it represented a fork in her career path. She had successfully transformed from undercover operative to institutional reformer, from individual protector to systemic change agent. The question now was whether she wanted to continue operating within military structures or expand her impact through different channels. 5 years later, the email arrived on a Tuesday morning, sent through encrypted channels that Elena recognized from her pre-military life. The sender was listed as academic consultant, but the message header contained authentication codes that identified the real source: an interagency task force addressing systematic sexual exploitation within federal institutions. Subject: Consulting Opportunity, Educational Institution Review. Dr. Vasquez, your expertise in institutional culture change would be valuable for our current project examining protection mechanisms within university systems. Compensation: $250,000 annually, plus benefits. Duration: 24 months minimum. Location: Washington, D.C. with travel as required. If interested, please respond using established protocols. Elena read the message twice before deleting it, following security procedures that had become automatic over the years. The offer represented everything she had been working toward: recognition of her expertise, resources sufficient to create meaningful change, and scope of authority to address problems at their root causes. She was tempted. Her current position as Director of Military Sexual Assault Prevention Programs provided significant influence and resources, but it also constrained her to working within military bureaucracies that changed slowly and often resisted innovations. That challenged traditional power structures. But as she looked around her office, walls decorated with thank you letters from soldiers whose lives had been changed by her programs, shelves lined with research documenting their success, and windows overlooking training facilities where young men and women to protect themselves and each other, Elena realized that her work here wasn't finished. On her desk, the ceramic elephant held its familiar position, trunk raised in eternal optimism. Rosa had visited the previous month, now a graduate student in social work who was writing her thesis on institutional responses to gender-based violence. She had been amazed by the changes at Fort Davidson, impressed by her sister's transformation. From silent protector to public advocate. "You know what I realized?" Rosa had said during their last conversation. "The elephant was perfect for you, but not for the reason I thought. I gave it to you because elephants never forget, and I wanted you to remember your strength. But elephants are also known for something else. They change entire landscapes just by existing. They create paths that other animals follow for generations." Elena had understood the metaphor. Her work at Fort Davidson had created new pathways for addressing institutional dysfunction, models that were being replicated across the military and beyond. The young women she had mentored were now mentoring others, creating expanding networks of knowledge and support that would outlast any individual career. 10 years later, the Supreme Court decision was announced on a Friday afternoon in March, sending shockwaves through institutional hierarchies across the nation. Davidson v. Department of Defense, established new legal precedents for institutional liability in cases of systematic sexual harassment, creating financial incentives for organizations to implement effective prevention programs rather than simply responding to incidents after they occurred. Elena watched the news coverage from her office at Georgetown University, where she now served as director of the Institute for Institutional Culture Change. The case had grown out of a class action lawsuit filed by survivors from multiple military installations, supported by evidence and testimony that traced directly back to the documentation and advocacy work that had begun at Fort Davidson over a decade earlier. The plaintiff's lead attorney was Sarah Kim, now a civilian lawyer specializing in institutional accountability cases. The primary expert witness had been Elena herself, though her testimony had been given under sealed conditions that protected operational details of her intelligence background. Dr. Vasquez? Her assistant appeared in the doorway, carrying a manila envelope marked with familiar security classifications. This just arrived by special courier. Elena accepted the envelope, recognizing the sender codes immediately. Inside was a handwritten note from Rosa, now Dr. Rosa Vasquez, Director of Victim Services for the Interagency Task Force on Institutional Sexual Violence. Elena, the Supreme Court decision makes it official. Your model is now the legal standard for institutional prevention programs. Every university, military installation, and federal agency in the country will be implementing versions of what you created at Fort Davidson. But more importantly, I wanted you to know about something that happened last week. I was conducting training at a small college in Ohio, and one of the participants was a young woman who told me she had learned about advocacy and self-protection from her aunt, who was a military veteran. When I asked the aunt's name, she said Elena Vasquez. It turns out you mentored her aunt 8 years ago at Fort Davidson. That woman went on to become a victim advocate herself, working with college students. She taught her niece everything you had taught her about recognizing danger, documenting problems, and seeking help effectively. When that niece faced harassment from a professor last semester, she was prepared. She documented everything, built a support network, and reported the behavior through proper channels. The professor was removed. Other victims came forward, and the university implemented new policies that will protect future students. The niece said her aunt always told her that you had taught her the most important lesson of her life, that she wasn't powerless, that she had agency, and that protecting herself and others was both a right and a responsibility. That's 3 generations of women now, you, her aunt, and her niece, who have used what you taught to create change. I thought you should know that your work is living on in ways you might never have imagined. The elephant remembers, and so do the rest of us. With love and admiration. Rosalina set the letter aside and walked to her window, looking out over the Georgetown campus, where students moved through their daily routines with the casual confidence of people who believed their educational environment was safe and supportive. Most of them had no idea that their safety was maintained by systems built on knowledge gained from years of patient work in places where safety couldn't be taken for granted. Her phone rang, the secure line that connected her to various federal agencies when they needed consultation on institutional problems that required unconventional approaches. She had become the person that government officials called when traditional solutions weren't sufficient, when complex problems required someone who understood both official channels and unofficial realities. Dr. Vasquez, this is Assistant Director Chun from the FBI's Crimes Against Children Unit. We have a situation involving systematic abuse at a religious institution, and we need someone with your expertise in institutional culture change. Can we schedule a consultation? Of course, Elena replied, already reaching for her calendar. When do you need me? The work continued, evolving and expanding, but never really ending. There were always new predators to stop, new systems to reform, new generations of potential victims to educate and empower. It was the kind of career that could consume a person completely, that could define an entire life around the fight against institutional dysfunction. But as Elena scheduled the consultation and began reviewing background materials for another complex case, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition or career advancement. Somewhere in Ohio, a young woman was using knowledge that traced back to conversations in a military communications room years earlier. Somewhere in the military, other women were teaching new soldiers how to protect themselves and their colleagues. Somewhere in institutions across the country, predators were finding it increasingly difficult to operate because their preferred tactics no longer worked against prepared and empowered targets. The ceramic elephant watched from its position of honor on Elena's bookshelf, surrounded by awards and commendations from organizations she had helped transform. Its trunk remained raised in eternal optimism, its painted eyes bright with the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories were measured not in individual defeats of specific enemies, but in the gradual transformation of entire systems. Elena had spent 23 years learning that real strength wasn't about dominating others or surviving individual attacks. Real strength was about creating conditions where attacks became less likely, where potential victims became active agents of change, where institutional cultures evolved to protect the vulnerable rather than enabling their exploitation. The work would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by the thousands of women and men who had learned that they weren't powerless, that they had choices, that protecting themselves and others was both a right and a responsibility. 20 years later, the memorial service was held at Fort Davidson, on a crisp autumn morning that painted the parade ground in shades of gold and amber. Elena had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 67, surrounded by family and colleagues who had gathered to honor a life dedicated to service that extended far beyond any official record. Colonel Patricia Reeves, now a retired general, delivered the primary eulogy to an audience that included military personnel, federal officials, and civilian advocates who had worked with Elena over the decades. Elena Vasquez taught us that real leadership isn't about commanding others. Reeves said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. It's about empowering others to protect themselves and their communities. She showed us that systemic change requires patience, preparation, and the courage to work quietly for years before seeing results. In the front row, Rosa sat with her own daughter, a 22-year-old recent graduate who had grown up hearing stories about her legendary aunt. The young woman carried herself with the quiet confidence that Elena had spent decades teaching others to cultivate aware without being paranoid, prepared without being fearful, strong without needing to dominate. Aunt Elena used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid, Rosa's daughter whispered as the ceremony concluded. It was about being afraid and choosing to act anyway, especially when you're the only one who can. Behind them, hundreds of men and women who had been touched by Elena's work stood in respectful silence. Some were soldiers who had learned self-protection and advocacy skills that had changed their lives. Others were federal agents who had worked with her on complex institutional cases. Still others were educators, social workers, and victim advocates who had implemented her models in universities, corporations, and government agencies across the globe. The ceramic elephant had been placed on Elena's casket, its cheerful colors bright against the formal military drape. It would later be given to Rosa's daughter, continuing a tradition of remembrance that had begun in a military communications room decades earlier. As the crowd began to disperse, Sergeant Katie Morrison, now Colonel Morrison, commanding officer of Fort Davidson, approached Rosa with an envelope. "Your sister asked me to give this to you," Morrison said. "She wrote it 6 months ago when she first received her diagnosis. She wanted you to have it after the service." Rosa opened the envelope with trembling fingers, recognizing Elena's precise handwriting immediately. "Rosa, if you're reading this, Then the work has been passed to you and the others who understand that real change happens one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of courage at a time. I never told you the whole truth about my military service, about the work I did before the army, or about the reasons I made certain choices throughout my career. The complete story is classified at levels that will probably outlast both of us. But I can tell you this, everything I did was aimed at a single goal, ensuring that the next generation would be safer than the one before it. The elephant you gave me became a symbol of something larger than either of us imagined. It reminded me that some forms of strength are measured not in individual victories, but in the long-term changes we create by refusing to accept that victimization is inevitable. You've already begun that work in your own career, your research, your advocacy, your commitment to evidence-based prevention. All of it builds on foundations that extend back through generations of women who refuse to be silent. But there's more work to be done. The models we've created for addressing institutional sexual violence can be adapted to other forms of systematic oppression. The networks we've built can be expanded to address different kinds of institutional dysfunction. The young people we've trained can teach others to recognize and resist abuse in all its forms. The elephant remembers, but more importantly, it teaches. Every person who learns to protect themselves and others becomes a teacher for the next person who needs that knowledge. Every institution that changes its culture creates a model for other institutions to follow. Every predator who faces real consequences sends a message to other potential predators that their behavior will not be tolerated. My life's work has been about multiplication, one person teaching another, who teaches another, who teaches another, until the knowledge spreads beyond any individual's ability to contain or control it. You've inherited that responsibility now, along with everyone else who understands that silence enables oppression, and that speaking truth requires both courage and strategy. Use what I taught you. Adapt it to new challenges. Pass it on to people who will face problems we can't yet imagine. And remember that the most important victories often look like defeats to outside observers, that the most effective work happens in quiet moments between individuals, and that real strength is measured not by what you can take from others, but by what you can help them discover within themselves. The elephant's trunk is raised not just in optimism, but in determination. It points toward a future where institutional protections actually protect people instead of protecting institutions, where potential victims understand their own agency, and where predators find their preferred tactics no longer work because too many people have learned to recognize and resist them. That future is possible. You've already helped create it. With love and confidence in the path ahead. ELENAPS. There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Arlington. The key is taped under the elephant's base. Inside you'll find documents that explain some of the work I couldn't discuss while I was alive, along with contact information for people who can help you continue certain aspects of it if you choose to do so. The choice, as always, is yours. Rosa read the letter twice before sharing it with her daughter, who absorbed every word with the careful attention that Elena had taught her to apply to important information. So what do we do now? The young woman asked. Rosa looked around the military cemetery where Elena lay surrounded by others who had dedicated their lives to service that extended beyond personal ambition. In the distance, Fort Davidson's buildings rose against the afternoon sky, housing new generations of soldiers who served in an environment that had been fundamentally transformed by one woman's patient, persistent work. We continue, Rosa said simply. We adapt what she taught us to new challenges. We pass it on to people who need it. And we remember that real change happens when individuals choose to take responsibility for creating the world they want to live in. 30 years later, the documentary premiered on a crisp evening in November. BROADCST simultaneously across multiple networks and streaming platforms, to a global audience estimated at over 50 million viewers. The Elephant Remembers: How One Woman Changed Military Culture had been 5 years in production, featuring interviews with dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Elena's work. The film opened with footage of Rosa's daughter now, Dr. Maria Vasquez, director of the Global Institute for Institutional Protection, speaking at the United Nations about worldwide implementation of Elena's prevention models. My great-aunt Elena used to say that every elephant in the herd protects every calf, Maria explained to the international audience. That's what we've tried to build: communities where everyone takes responsibility for protecting everyone else, where predators can't operate because their tactics no longer work against prepared and connected targets. The documentary traced Elena's impact through multiple generations and institutions. Former soldiers described how her mentorship had changed their understanding of strength and agency. Federal agents discussed cases that had been solved using investigative techniques she had developed. University administrators explained how her institutional models had been adapted to address campus sexual assault, but perhaps most powerfully, the film featured testimony from hundreds of women who had never met Elena personally but whose lives had been changed by knowledge that traced back to her work. A college student in California who had recognized grooming behavior because of training developed from Elena's models. A corporate employee in New York who had successfully reported harassment because she had learned documentation techniques from Elena's programs. A military spouse in Germany who had helped her husband understand how to support survivors because of educational materials that Elena had written decades earlier. The pattern repeated across continents and cultures: individuals who had learned to protect themselves and others who had passed that knowledge forward, who had created expanding networks of awareness and resistance that made institutional abuse increasingly difficult to sustain. The remarkable thing about Elena Vasquez, said the documentary's narrator, is that her greatest victories were largely invisible to her contemporaries. She spent most of her career working quietly to prevent problems rather than publicly responding to them. Her success is measured not in awards or recognition, but in the countless assaults that never happened, the careers that weren't destroyed, the lives that weren't shattered by institutional predation. The film concluded with footage from the memorial service 30 years earlier, focusing on the ceramic elephant that had become an international symbol of protection and remembrance. Replicas were now displayed in victim advocacy centers, university counseling offices, and military installations around the world, each one carrying the same message: remember your strength, protect your community, and never accept that victimization is inevitable. As the credits rolled, a final statistic appeared on screen. In the 40 years since Elena Vasquez began her work at Fort Davidson, reported rates of institutional sexual assault in participating organizations have decreased by 89%. More importantly, anonymous surveys suggest that actual assault rates have decreased by similar margins, indicating that prevention rather than simply improved reporting accounts for the majority of this change. The documentary's impact was immediate and global. Within weeks of its premiere, educational institutions, government agencies, and private corporations were requesting consultations on implementing Elena's models. The Global Institute for Institutional Protection, now led by Maria Vasquez, found itself overwhelmed with requests for training, technical assistance, and program development support. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source: a new generation of young people who had grown up in institutional environments shaped by Elena's work and now wanted to extend that protection to challenges she had never addressed. Climate change activists requested training on preventing the sexual harassment that often drove women out of environmental organizing. Immigration advocacy groups sought consultation on protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation by those offering assistance. Corporate employees asked for guidance on addressing systematic racism and discrimination using models developed for addressing sexual assault. Each new application required adaptation and innovation. But the fundamental principles remained constant: education over ignorance, preparation over helplessness, community protection over individual vulnerability, and systemic change over individual punishment. Aunt Elena was right about multiplication, Maria reflected during a planning meeting for the Institute's expanding programs. Every person we teach becomes a teacher. Every institution that changes becomes a model. Every predator who faces consequences sends a message to others. She looked up at the ceramic elephant that occupied a place of honor in her office, not the original, which remained with Rose's family, but one of thousands of replicas that had been distributed to organizations implementing Elena's models. Worldwide. The question isn't whether we can prevent all forms of institutional abuse, Maria continued. The question is whether we're willing to do the patient, persistent work necessary to make abuse so difficult that most potential predators choose not to attempt it. The elephant watched with painted eyes bright with secrets that were no longer secret, trunk raised toward a future where Elena's vision had become reality, a world where institutions actually protected the people they claimed to serve, where potential victims understood their own agency, and where predators found their preferred tactics ineffective against communities that had learned to protect themselves and each other. The work continued, carried forward by thousands of individuals who had learned that real strength wasn't about individual dominance, but about collective protection, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it, and that the most important victories were often invisible to outside observers but created ripple effects that lasted for generations. For 12 years, Elena had seemed defenseless, but she had used that appearance to build something much more powerful than individual strength, a system of knowledge, preparation, and mutual protection that would outlast any single predator, any individual institution, any personal career. The elephant remembered, and through its memory, Elena's legacy lived on in every person who had learned that they were not powerless, in every institution that had chosen protection over reputation, and in every future victim who would be safe because someone had refused to accept that victimization was inevitable.